It's such good old summertime in New York. It's summertime. Keep your radio on for more fun in the sun with WABC.
77 Radio in New York, WABC. I'm Jack Carney. We're at Freedomland. Where are you? Why aren't you here? Want to have fun? Come join us. We're in the Opera House. And I think you'll enjoy your stay at Freedomland. I think you'll come back often, right? But do come see us. This afternoon, the weather's very nice. Temperature 86 degrees at Freedomland as Tony Orlando sings the number 12 song on the 70s.
And indeed, in 1960 through 1964, everyone in the Northeast was headed to Freedomland USA. It was the Disneyland of the East Coast. In fact, the similarities of Freedomland and Disneyland, very much so, in fact, because the people who helped design Disneyland also came to make Freedomland into the Disneyland of the Northeast. Freedomland was actually so unique it was shaped in the map of the United States of America, which indeed would depict historical themes throughout the park. Here we're looking at little old New York with its horse-drawn streetcars. Those horse-drawn streetcars would take you from little old New York to Chicago, where one could view the Chicago fire, and we'll have more on that a bit later. Freedomland Amusement Park was the world's largest outdoor entertainment center, featuring marching bands. Paul LaValle's orchestra would perform there, and so many celebrities would appear, and we'll also tell you more about that later in this program. Here we see some Mexican entertainers in the Southwest area in which they would be performing Mexican dances, and of course the beautiful Consuela there would be doing some dancing as well. Freedomland had so much to offer that many of us remember as we would come through the main gates here at Freedomland. We could hardly wait to get that Disneyland experience here in the East Coast. And of course, remember, back in 1960, we had heard so much about Walt Disney's Disneyland. When the opportunity came for having that Disneyland experience in the East Coast in our own backyard in the Bronx, we jumped at that opportunity. In fact, on opening day, on June the 19th in 1960, the overflow crowd was so great that 65,000 people had entered the park by 2 o'clock. But they went on the New York City radio stations telling everyone to stay away. There was no more room. In fact, Pat Boone and his wife and family had conducted the ribbon-cutting ceremony earlier that morning. Again, here we're looking at more of little old New York. There's R.H. Macy's that had a large display of a Macy's store in which people could buy dry goods as well as many of the souvenirs. And we'll talk a little bit about those souvenirs, too, in just a few moments. Here again, some more of the stores at Freedomland that featured all types of souvenirs and also giving you the opportunity to bring home that Freedomland experience with those souvenirs. Many stores here, as well as the New York Harbor depicted there at the top of your screen, in which you could ride a New York Harbor tugboat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Again, some more of the stores. Even the Schering Drug Company had a display there, and they gave out little samples of Corsidon that people could take home with them. Here again is the Macy's store, and in fact this Macy's store was an exact replica of a store that was in New York City back in the 1800s. Again, people shopping in Macy's, able to purchase many of those souvenirs that we talked about. The horse-drawn streetcars were always popular and very well crowded, too, as you can see, with people taking that ride from little old New York, and you see the tracks crossing each other in which the streetcars could pass each other so close, yet they wouldn't hit each other, too. The streetcars at Freedomland would be powered by 2 horses. Disneyland, for instance, would have 1 horse pulling their streetcars, just a little bit different, but the same idea. And, of course, too, those horse cars, as we said, would take you from little old New York on its way to Chicago. And you can see them making the turnaround there through the streets of little old New York and heading out into Chicago. Here we're looking at Chinatown now, which was in the San Francisco area of Freedomland. Again, keep in mind, Freedomland was in the shape of the United States. And here again is Chinatown, which also featured the famous Chungking restaurant. And here you see the Chungking restaurant, which was very popular back in the early 1960s, Chungking, and they had a large restaurant at Freedomland. And here a gentleman is pulling some children in a rickshaw there and posing for the camera. You might be able to make out some of those prices, too, which now seem very, very cheap. But back then, well, kind of expensive, I guess. Here are some of the San Francisco junks that were placed in the San Francisco area. Actually, also in the San Francisco area was a seal pool. And that seal pool was very popular, where you could feed fish to the seals in the San Francisco wharf. And actually, in the wintertime, the caretakers had to go to Freedomland every day to make sure the seals were okay. Now we're looking at the Buccaneer Ride, which was located in the New Orleans area, in which you'd be riding inside a dark ride and seeing pirates battling it out, somewhat similar to today's Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean. But this was a forerunner of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Kodak Company had a large display there at Freedomland, and you see the people going inside the Kodak store buying their film. Also popular, the glass blowers, in which you could purchase anything made out of glass for 25 cents up to expensive $10 to $15. The Schaefer Brewery Company, depicted here, had inside little gnomes that would show you how beer was made. Very popular. And there you can see one of the little gnomes in the picture at the left of the screen by the barrel near the woman in the photo. The Great Lakes Beer Garden was also very popular, sort of a German-type beer garden right on the Great Lakes. Again, keeping in mind, another great eating place, Libby's Hacienda, where you could get Sloppy Joes. Sloppy Joes were introduced at Freedomland in the Bronx and, of course, caught on through today. Here's some of the decorative statues that were placed throughout the Chicago area of Freedomland. Here's Digger O'Toole, the friendly undertaker that gave King Corn stamps. At least his little business card said that. And here's some clowns that were at Freedomland as well.
Come on out to Freedomland for the greatest time you've ever planned. Fun and thrills go hand in hand at exciting Freedomland. Bring along your special friends. Fun begins, it never ends. You can stand in the full moonlight in the moon glow every night. Hey, low price for you provide. A new midway over 45 ride. Circus show and stars galore. You can ask for anything more.
What's great about it now? At Freedomland, only $2.50 plus tax for children all day and everyone every night from 6 p.m. Tonight through Saturday, the Lennon Sisters. Plus through Friday, Peter Palmer and his orchestra right there at Freedomland.
Hey, anytime you come is fine. Late or early, you're still on time. Come on out, take my advice. Have a high time at a low price.
Where?
Freedomland.
Huh?
Freedomland.
What?
Freedomland.
What?
Freedomland.
Oh, that's the place, yeah.
That was Paul Anka singing one of the many Freedomland commercials. Paul Anka also appearing at Freedomland, as well as so many other great performers and entertainers. We'll talk about that a little bit. Freedomland also not offering major attractions for adults and families. Would also have a Kiddyland park that was added in the Chicago area in other years. Now we're looking at the Mule Go Round. This was a unique carousel depicted in the Midwest, right by Elsie's farm. Borden's Elsie would have a farm there, and there's a merry-go-round powered by a mule. It was called the Mule Go Round, and people, as well as adults and children, would ride that Mule Go Round. Here's Freedomland's carousel, known as King Rex's Carousel, located in the New Orleans area. This carousel, so popular at the time that everyone would rush to get on that carousel. In fact, merry-go-rounds were very popular at all amusement parks, and this carousel was somewhat unique. Not only did it have horses, but it also had other animals like lions and tigers and llamas. In the later operation of Freedomland's years in 1963 and 64, they put again in the Chicago area, they called the State Fair. This was a wild mouse ride. They also added an Arnold Palmer putting golf course, which was popular at the time, and they made a large one at Freedomland, the Arnold Palmer miniature golf. The monorail roller coaster was added as well in 1964, $1 million monorail Italian roller coaster. Here are the Wiggly Worm and jets, the jets that would be powered in the Kiddyland area and the State Fair area of Chicago were featured. Now we're looking at Danny the Dragon. This was a unique ride in the New Orleans area, that people would ride this dragon, smoke would come out of his mouth, and also you would see the storybook characters of Mother Goose, Fairyland. And there were beautiful flowers that would rival the New York Botanical Gardens throughout the route. Up ahead the street, the Harbor Tugboat Ride. You can see the entrance to the Harbor Tugboat Ride, the building up ahead, and people heading in that direction. Here's a shot of one of the two riverboats, the sternwheelers featured at Freedomland. This was an aerial view, the back view of the sternwheeler making its rounds through. And here's part of the Great Lakes. By the way, the Great Lakes were actually a replica of the Great Lakes. The lakes themselves were about 6 foot deep, and the boats were on a track with the exception of the ferry boats. As you see there, the tugboats, I should say. Those tugboats, and we'll have more on those later, were not operated on a track. The riverboats were, and some of the other boats at Freedomland. All in all, there were 8 miles of water at Freedomland. Here again, one of the riverboats, the Canadian. They had 2 riverboats, the American and the Canadian, hence the fact of the Great Lakes. These sternwheelers were 110 foot in length. They were built by the famous Todd Shipyard Companies, and they were assembled at Freedomland. The Todd Shipyard Companies made these riverboats. Actually, all the boats at Freedomland were made by the famous Todd Shipyard Company. Again, the boats were 110 foot in length, these 2 riverboats. You see the sternwheeler paddle there making its way along the Great Lakes in Freedomland. While you're on one boat, the other boat would pull out, and the next boat would pull in, and they would load those boats up. They'd have music on the boat, and always those boats were quite well filled. Also, you would see a bird island, as it was called. They had all kinds of birds on the island, and the Welch's Grape Company in the New England area, as you would travel along on the boat, you could see to your right these grapevines growing, and the train would be passing by as well. You get the train blowing its whistle, the riverboat blowing its whistle, and you had sort of an interesting sound, so to speak. Here is one of the tugboats, the Totsie. This tugboat, again, was operating as it comes around the bend here underneath the train trestle, was not operating on a track. A lot of people thought that the boats were on tracks. The riverboat was on a track, and also the Northwest Fur Trappers boat, which was another ride which we'll get to in a few moments, that was on a track. However, these tugboats were free-floating tugboats, and they were not on tracks, and they were always loaded with people, and you can see here in this view quite a few people just standing up. Some people would be able to sit down, but it could carry quite a few. Another ride, the first couple of years of Freedomland's 5-season operation, the Indian Canoe Ride. These were actually Chippewa canoes. They had real Mohawk Indians that were guides on these boats. There were a lot of Mohawk Indians, they said, living at the time in New York City. In Manhattan in particular, they were hired by Freedomland, and they were quite authentic in their guidance of the people to be in charge of these canoes, as the canoes would ply through the Great Lakes and head towards New York. Here we're looking at the Northwest Fur Trappers Ride, speaking of Indians, in which you would ride a bull boat in Oregon and relive the Lewis and Clark expedition. Here we're caught between a crossfire between the settlers and the Indians, as you see fire belching from the rifles and the banging of the rifles going off. Again, on the Northwest Fur Trappers Ride, we're coming into a ghost town. And we see some of the people who were one-time miners. Now they're skeletons, and the skeletons are living on in this ghost town. And you see them waving to the folks, and also they had some skeleton horses. One of the favorite views was seeing the character who was fishing, not him, the guy who's being hung, but there's a guy who was fishing, catching a skeleton fish. That was kind of a unique thing, and hopefully we'll see that. There he is, the guy who's fishing, and he's catching a skeleton fish. That was something else you would see on board the Northwest Fur Trappers boat. So many animated things along that ride. The bridge would come down near the boat. There'd be bears. The pilot of the boat would pull out a gun to scare the bear and fire it off. And if you're a little kid, you ate this stuff up because you thought it was real. And to many of us, it seemed that way. The people who worked at Freedomland, there were 3,000 employees at the time. They really did their best. The Civil War exhibit in the New Orleans area. This, another extremely popular ride. You would ride a war correspondence wagon the first 2 years, then they added a trackless train. You would see the Battle of the Blue and the Gray. And actually, you would see the battle because they had animated figures. And again, this is before Disney's audio animatronics. These figures would be shooting at each other. There'd be explosions. Water would be blowing up around you. And you can see some of the men. Here's the cannons firing and the water blowing up around you. And you actually were in the midst of the Civil War. And you'd see some of the casualties, and you see some of the bunkers that were set up. And this was quite a popular ride at Freedomland, one of the best rides, as some of us would relive and remember from Freedomland, this Civil War attraction, a battle of the blue and the gray. And as we said, the way it was displayed was well done, especially, again, we're thinking 1960 through 1964. Remember, technology what it was. This was quite advanced for its time, as was the whole park. Again, you compare 1960 through what you have today, and still Freedomland would hold up quite well and beyond some of the attractions of some amusement parks today. Here again, we're looking at some more of the firing. There's a rebel firing again at the Union, and we're caught in the crossfire. And we see some of the other Civil War soldiers here, too. And also, in just a few moments, you'll be seeing Lee surrendering to Grant. They actually built a replica of the Appomattox Courthouse at Freedomland, and that's coming up, too, in just a moment. You see some of the soldiers there in the camp getting ready for the next battle. Again, the Civil War attraction, a very popular attraction at Freedomland. And here we are coming to the courthouse at Appomattox, and Lee surrendering to Grant. And again, that would be the conclusion of the Civil War ride. The ride itself was about a 7-8 minute ride. There's one of the soldiers up above who was keeping guard as you went through the Civil War ride. Again, still some more shots of the Civil War ride. And there's Grant waving to Lee as Lee was riding to the courthouse to surrender. Now we come to Chicago, getting set for the big Chicago fire. Engine Company number 8. They actually had authentic hand pumpers in which people would be helping the firemen at Freedomland to help put out the Chicago fire. The funny part is they would relive the Chicago fire by bringing out a cow and a man dressed as Mrs. O'Leary. And the cow would be mooing at people, and some people have said that the cow was seemed to be trained to kick over a lantern that would actually start the fire. Some people say they saw that. Maybe not all of us got a chance to see that cow being so talented, but it was quite something to think about, reliving the Chicago fire and Mrs. O'Leary's cow, at least getting the blame for it. Here's some of the rubble of the streets of Chicago, in which you would see some of the buildings that were supposedly damaged by the Great Chicago Fire. Here is the fire in its full inferno. It was always crowded. People would gather around to see the fire start, and then they would look for kids to help the firemen pump to put out the fire. Now, if you were one of the lucky ones selected to put out the fire, once the fire was out, they would give out certificates to each of the kids, and that certificate would say, "I helped put out the fire, the Great Chicago Fire in Freedomland." And a lot of kids would get those certificates, and I wonder how many kids today, who are now adults, still might have those certificates, maybe in their attic somewhere. But you can see the fire is well under control. Now, another interesting note, there are still some firemen, alumni of Freedomland, who meet once a year. These guys have kept in touch with each other, and they kind of get together and relive old stories about how they were the firemen at Freedomland's Chicago Fire, which is kind of a fun thing. So there's a lot of folks, obviously, who had worked at Freedomland. Even though the park was open for 5 seasons, they kept in touch with each other and made quite a few friends, as the Chicago Fire itself was a major attraction. A lot of folks today, when they remember Freedomland, certainly remember the big Chicago Fire. In fact, some of the Freedomland jingles that were broadcast on television would emphasize, "You'll see the Great Chicago Fire. Look out, the flames are getting higher." And that was part of the jingle for Freedomland on TV. And again, this is the main building now that would always be caught on fire, and it would burn every hour on the hour. When Freedomland first opened, it would burn every 20 minutes, and then they kind of adjusted the time, making the fire every hour on the hour that the Chicago fire would burn, and people would come to watch that. You can see, too, so much went into Freedomland with the decorations that were put up, if you will. They planted 15,000 trees and plants at the park, which had to be added to a once swampland. So you can imagine all that went into Freedomland at a cost at the time of initially $17 million, which was $2 million more than Disneyland cost in 1955. By the time the park was underway, and over the last 4 years, up to $65 million was invested. Here's the Burro Trail ride, where you could ride the burros in the Southwest. You'd had a fellow who was your pack mule advisor, if you will, and you'd be riding these burros throughout the Southwest. And there you see the kids on the Burro Trail. And here's the stagecoach ride. This was also very popular in the Southwest as you would go into Fort Calvary, and this was a large fort. You could catch the stagecoach ride, and people would ride on top, and there'd be holdups of the stagecoach, just as there would be holdups by bandits of the train that would be riding around the park. But the stagecoach ride was very popular, too, and you could get a glimpse of buffalo or bison that were actually grazing at Freedomland. Freedomland would bring in bison each year and have them, they brought them in from Oklahoma, and have them grazing out there as well. Here we're looking at a trout fishing exhibit that was set up where for 50 cents you could try your luck to catch some trout. And yes, you could take them home too if you were lucky. If you wanted to do some trout fishing at Freedomland, you had that opportunity as well. Here we see some teepees and totem poles. This was in the Southwest area. Great for posing. You could bring your camera or 8mm, as a lot of folks did, and pose for photos. And here that young gentleman is posing with the totem poles. Now, this was also the scene of a gunfight between Indians as well as cowboys in the Southwest. And here's one of the leather company's stores that was featured in the Southwest. The Tandy Leather Company, which later became Radio Shack, had an exhibit there at Freedomland. King Corn Stamps had sponsored the Kitty Country Fair in the later years of Freedomland in its fourth year, in which they would have little exhibits for kids, obviously a kiddie land area. There's Elsie's boudoir. Elsie the cow and her calves would be inside, and they would be in beds. And this was the most unique thing to see, a cow and her calves in bed. And it was quite an exhibit that was set up. Borden's Farm had Elsie the cow at Freedomland, a full-fledged farm itself. They actually had corn growing there, tomato plants, squash. It was a full working farm at Freedomland each and every year. Here we're seeing an aerial shot of the trestle, the Santa Fe Railroad that would go along there, and in the distance is the Hollywood Arena. This is the San Francisco train station. You could get on in Chicago and get off the train in San Francisco. In San Francisco, they feature the San Francisco Earthquake Ride, as well as some other rides in the San Francisco area, but the San Francisco Earthquake Ride was quite an attraction in itself. Here, the train pulling into the station, the story in the trains themselves. These were narrow-gauge railroad trains that came from the Edaville Railroad in South Carver, Massachusetts. The unique story about this is that every spring, the trains would be brought down on a truck, and they would have to make the trip several times. They only had room for the engine and one car, and they would make that trip back and forth until they filled up both trains. Now, they had two sets of trains working at Freedomland, and any given time on a very crowded day, each train probably had about 6 or 7 cars. So you can imagine what this would have been, traveling from the Bronx on the New England Thruway up to Massachusetts to South Carver to bring those trains down. And then when Freedomland would close for the winter, they'd bring the trains back up because they used them in Edaville for a Christmas display in which they would take people around up in South Carver at the Edaville Railroad. These trains themselves have some great history going back in time to the late 1800s, early 1900s, initially from Maine. They were purchased and used in Edaville since the 1940s. And an interesting turn of events these days, those trains are now back in Maine as the Edaville Railroad sold those trains back to Maine. And some of them have now worked their way back to Edaville, which is now in operation again. So it's a kind of unique story with those trains. Here you can see the two river boats, a view from the train, also the ore bucket rides, which we'll get into in just a few moments. as we take a look at some more of the teepees and other exhibits at Freedomland. So many things to talk about, and what you could see at Freedomland, it would take a long time to go over those attractions as to what were featured at Freedomland. There you can see one of the steam engines pulling the cars, with again loaded with people. And keep in mind, when we say narrow gauge, the rails were only 2 feet apart. And yet these trains were large trains. They weren't toy trains. These were big trains, although the rails were just 2 feet apart. They were mostly used in England, and they were also then brought to the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and used particularly in Maine. The advantage of narrow gauge is that you can make real sharp turns around mountains, and that was the basis for using narrow gauge. But again, look at the fine detail and the work that was done to give a Western look, if you will, for these trains at Freedomland. And you see the engineer inside there. Those trains were operated by coal, and many times you'd see the engineer shoveling the coal into the tender. And these engineers were all union people, too. And there was a story behind that as well. The people from Edaville would send their instructors down, but they weren't allowed to touch the trains while they were at Freedomland, even though they knew more about the trains and how to take care of them, perhaps, than some of the engineers. But these guys were union, and they were the only ones that could run the trains while they were at Freedomland. You see the folks waving, which was always a great thing for the camera, to see people waving back and forth. And certainly when you're on the train or you're on the boat, you'd pass each other, and that was part of the fun and enjoyment as we see the train again coming across the water. And again, people would be waving from the boats to the train. Along that train ride, as we mentioned earlier, you could face a holdup, too, as a gang might be coming by of highwaymen holding up that train. Here we're looking at a quick shot at the Moon Bowl, which was Freedomland's Music and Dance Center, where some of the famous people like Count Basie, Paul Anka, Bobby Darin, the Everly Brothers, Ricky Nelson, Tony Bennett, Bobby Rydell, even the Three Stooges appeared at the Moon Bowl. Now we're looking at the Braniff Spaceship. This was one of the first spaceship rides that was featured at any amusement park, in which you actually thought you were being blasted off into outer space. It would hold over 300 people in this auditorium. You would actually think you're being blasted off into outer space with sound effects. They'd show up on the screen. North America and South America, which was a great commercial for Braniff Airlines. In later years, Dick Clark would broadcast a radio show from the Moon Bowl, coming to you right from that spaceship at the Moon Bowl. Braniff Airways, again, a big sponsor, as were so many big sponsors at Freedomland, which was also part of the attraction, all these different exhibits that were set up, and again, all free. Keeping in mind, here in Satellite City, which is what we're looking at now, these stars that appeared there in concert all appeared as part of your admission. No extra charge, where today amusement parks charge for these extra concerts. Keep that in mind. The Spaceway, as you look ahead to the right, was a 1-mile turnpike ride in which you drive the small cars. Now we're looking at the Ore Bucket ride, which was very popular. This Ore Bucket ride indeed was one of the unique ones in the United States. The sky rides were just coming about. Disneyland had it. Freedomland had these sky rides in which you travel in what was called ore buckets, because you were coming from the Tucson mine, and you'd come from the southwest over to Chicago, where you could get off at Chicago, or if you were coming from Chicago, get off in the southwest. At Freedomland, they were called ore buckets. The unique thing at Freedomland, they had 4 sets of cables, meaning 2 buckets would travel in each direction. No other park has ever done that. Freedomland was the only park that did do that. Again, the Tucson Mining Company, they changed the colors on the ore buckets from the early years in which they were brown. They later changed them to a multicolored pattern. But again, the ride stayed the same, and you can see how high people were riding up in these ore buckets at the time. There were some people actually afraid to go on these ore bucket rides, and then finally they did, kind of being a daredevil at the time. And you can see some of the buckets swaying back and forth, and it might give you a second thought of riding these ore buckets. Our last view, in which we will be approaching in just a moment as we take our ride on the ore bucket here at Freedomland, is ironically that of the Orbucket House that was located in the Great Lakes in the Chicago area. We'll be coming to that in just a moment. It was also the last structure remaining for many years after Freedomland's demolition. In fact, it remained well into the 1970s as sort of a memorial or tombstone of this great theme park, and it wasn't until the 1990s that Freedomland was finally developed into a major shopping area. Mostly would say that, well, maybe Freedomland's demise was caused by the World's Fair of 1964 to 65, but that was not the case at all, as other evidence points to a planned closing of the park for profit takers and the construction of Co-op City. Some of us wonder what Freedomland would have been like today had it existed, but in our minds and our memories, Freedomland was one of the greatest amusement parks ever built, and we had it in the Bronx.
The most exciting event in the history of entertainment. Freedomland, the world's largest entertainment center, opens Sunday, June 19th. Freedomland, where the story of America comes to life in 205 fun-filled acres. Chicago in the 1870s, where you'll see the Chicago Fire. The thrilling saga of the Pony Express. 35 exciting rides at Freedomland for all ages, such as stagecoaches, antique automobiles, sternwheelers, and spaceships. Restaurant and snack facilities for every taste and pocketbook. Freedomland in the Bronx, bordered by the Hutchinson River Parkway and the New England Thruway. Parking for 10,000 cars, 30 minutes from Times Square by the IRT subways. Admission 50 cents to $1.